Welcome to Boricua Lessons. I'm your host, White Eagle's Revenge. Today's lesson, Birth of a Nation. Just days before leaving office, President Barack Obama commuted the sentence of Oscar Lopez Rivera, a man sentenced to 55 years in prison. Oscar Lopez Rivera is a very controversial figure in Puerto Rico and the United States. He's referred to as both a hero for the cause of freedom and a terrorist, depending on who you ask.
Is the former leader of Puerto Rican nationalist group known as the FALN, a militant organization responsible for more than 140 bombings on U.S. soil.
Well, he didn't do anything. He didn't steal anything. He didn't bomb anything. He didn't hurt anyone.
Oscar Lopez Rivera is nothing more than a terrorist. But worse, he's an unrepentant terrorist.
Thousands and thousands of people are demanding that he be released from jail. I urge President Obama to do that.
The enemies of our country are being rewarded and treated as if they're heroes.
That John Adams is a
Do you dare to compare Oscar Lopez Rivera, a socialist who went mad after living for years in Chicago, working as a community...
Franklin, who
oh, yes.
The same time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Way to clear that up for us. So as much as people on both sides have tried to oversimplify the situation for their own means, it once again falls upon yours truly to provide some historical perspective. To really understand the situation with Oscar Lopez Rivera, we need to have a basic understanding of the nationalist movement of the 60s and 70s. To really understand the motives of the nationalist movement of the 60s and 70s, we need to look at the nationalist revolt of the 1950s. We can't really understand that without discussing the rebirth of nationalism during the 1930s, and we can't really understand that without first having an understanding of the original nationalist movement against the Spanish. So, what I'm going to try to do is to give you a chronological summary that spans roughly 150 years in about 10 minutes so that you can at least understand what the heck people are ranting about when it comes to Puerto Rican nationalism and Oscar Lopez Rivera. Alrighty then, let's begin. We'll begin our narrative with a man who many refer to as the father of the Puerto Rican nation, Ramon Emeterio Betances. Betances was a medical doctor born in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, who obtained his medical degree from the University of Paris. He soon got into trouble with the Spanish authorities after his return to Puerto Rico because of his vocal support for the abolition of slavery and outspoken support for the total independence of Puerto Rico from Spain, something that earned him a swift exile from the island, but that did absolutely nothing to shut him up. Betances is perhaps best known for orchestrating the Grito de Lares, or the Freedom Cry of Lares, also known as the Lares Revolution. A group of Puerto Rican revolutionaries took over the town of Lares and proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Puerto Rico on September 23, 1865. Remember that date, it's important for later. In the end, almost 500 rebels were captured, but most of them were later given amnesty following one of the many regime changes in Spain during that period. The Lares Revolution failed to bring about the independence of Puerto Rico, but it did set in motion other significant events. After the revolt, other prominent Puerto Ricans were able to negotiate some concessions from Spain, including the abolition of slavery, which was a practice many Puerto Ricans thought was, well, pretty stupid, to be honest. There were a lot of freed slaves in Puerto Rico by that time, and even more people of mixed race, to include Betances himself, who was actually part African. There were later smaller skirmishes with the Spanish authorities in Puerto Rico. The most famous of these was the Intentona de Yauco, or Attempt of Yauco, another town in the interior of the island in 1897. The very next year, the United States declared war on Spain and actually invaded Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War, which is something that most American history books conveniently leave out even to this day. Many revolutionaries on the island initially welcomed the American forces, thinking that they would help them finally kick out the Spanish. So imagine their disappointment when at the conclusion of that whole pesky little Spanish-American War, the Americans actually decided to stay and annex Puerto Rico. After graduating high school in Ponce, young Pedro Albizu Campos earned a scholarship to study engineering at the University of Vermont, served as an officer in the U.S. Army during the First World War, and later earned a law degree from Harvard University. His education, passion, and oratory skills quickly propelled him to the presidency of the Nationalist Party in 1930. Since he was known to teach young Puerto Ricans about their history and about other struggles against imperial tyranny around the world, his followers started calling him El Maestro, the teacher. Throughout the 1930s, tensions on the island grew between the nationalists and the American authorities after several protests and strikes. Now, it's important to understand that at that time, the governor of Puerto Rico was not elected by the people, but appointed by the President of the United States, without any input from the people whatsoever. To this highly volatile environment, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt threw a match in the form of Blanton Winship, the 12th American governor of Puerto Rico. Blanton Winship saw the Nationalists as a threat to American sovereignty on the island, and to quell this threat, he militarized the police force and had them crack down on public demonstrations. Albizu Campos and other nationalist leaders were arrested and charged with seditious conspiracy. Tensions between the police and American citizens of Puerto Rico finally boiled over in an incident known as the Ponce Massacre. On Palm Sunday, March 21, 1937, the Insular Police Force of Puerto Rico fired indiscriminately into an unarmed crowd in downtown Ponce. When the shooting was over, 19 people lay dead, including a 13-year-old girl, and hundreds of civilian men, women, and children were wounded. Governor Winship reported to Washington that his police force had been fired on by nationalists from roofs and balconies, laying all the blame on the cadets of the Republic for the high civilian death toll and injuries. However, there were so many complaints from prominent citizens and local newspaper reports disputing the governor's account that ultimately the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights decided to investigate the incident itself. Arthur Garfield Hayes, a lawyer from the American Civil Liberties Union, was sent to Puerto Rico to perform an independent investigation. The report's conclusion was that Governor Winship had repeatedly violated the civil rights of the American citizens of Puerto Rico, had knowingly misled the American government in his initial report of the incident, and held him responsible for what it found, indeed, to be a massacre perpetrated by the Insular Police Force under his command. Now we could spend all day on the particulars of the Ponce Massacre, but the point to take away for the sake of this lesson is that while some in the U.S. Congress spoke out against Governor Winship and what they openly called his tyranny, neither Blanton Winship nor any of the police that actually perpetrated the massacre were ever arrested or disciplined in any way. The Nationalists now had their own rallying cry: remember the Ponce Massacre. By the way, you do not have to take my word for any of this. Actually, please don't. The Hayes Commission report is a public record, and at the time of this recording is also available for free from Google Books. It's the full investigation, which includes pictures, maps, as well as full statements submitted by witnesses and members of the government. During the late 40s and 50s, Puerto Rico went through a political shift that is referred to by many as the Democratic Revolution. In 1948, for the first time in history, the people of Puerto Rico elected their own governor, Luis Muñoz Marín. The elected representatives of Puerto Rico also drafted a constitution, and the negotiations ultimately resulted in the establishment of what is known officially in Spanish as El Estado Libre Asociado, or the Free Associated State of Puerto Rico. In the U.S., it's simply known as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. But not everything was Tinker Tape parades and Puerto Rican flags waving around. The Nationalists saw it as their mission to topple what they saw as a puppet government of the U.S. Throughout the early 1950s, the Nationalists conducted several armed attacks, to include an assassination attempt on Luis Muñoz Marín at the Fortaleza, the governor's mansion in San Juan. The government's heavy-handed response to these attacks is still the subject of much controversy. Pedro Albizu Campos was himself arrested again after a raid and an ensuing gunfight at his home. There were also attacks conducted by nationalists in the U.S. mainland during this time. One was the assassination attempt of President Harry Truman outside of Blair House. The last of these attacks came in 1954, 2 years after the establishment of the Commonwealth, when Lolita Lebrón led 3 men into the House of Representatives and shot at Congress while unfurling a flag of Puerto Rico, shouting, "Viva Puerto Rico Libre!" Long live free Puerto Rico. All 4 shooters were shortly apprehended, and no one was actually killed in the incident, but it certainly made for an interesting newsreel.
To Irving Forrest, Rafael Miranda, Mrs. Lolita Lebrón, Andre Cordero, the gun wielders, and to their accomplices goes the evil distinction of having perpetrated a criminal outrage almost unique in America's history.
Of course, after that, Lolita Lebrón became a feminist and revolutionary cult hero to many people in the anti-imperialist and socialist movements throughout Latin America. And so we get the next generation of aspiring nationalist revolutionaries. Among these new revolutionaries, the leading figure was a man named Filiberto Ojeda Ríos, also known as El Comandante, the commander. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Ojeda Ríos founded several organizations dedicated to what he referred to as the liberation of Puerto Rico. Among those organizations was the Armed Forces of National Liberation, known in Spanish as the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, or FALN, not to be confused with FLAN, which spells flan. The FALN conducted several bombing campaigns in the 60s and 70s, mostly within the city of New York, where it was their stated intent to weaken what they called the Yankee capitalist monopoly. 4 people lost their lives when a bomb that the FALN took credit for exploded inside Francis Tavern in New York on January 24, 1975. There were several other incidents that targeted NYPD and led to many other injuries. The group disbanded under pressure from the FBI as several of their members were arrested and their plans compromised. Ojeda Rios went on to found another group, the Boricua People's Army, also known as the Macheteros, or Machete Fighters. That nickname refers to Puerto Rican volunteers who fought against several invaders throughout the island's colonial history with nothing but machetes. The modern Macheteros' exploits have gained their own notoriety. They're known for the destruction of Air National Guard aircraft, the deadly ambush of a bus taking sailors to the Roosevelt Roads Naval Base, and the robbery of a Wells Fargo armored car. The group coordinated many of their exploits to take place on September 23rd to commemorate the latest revolution. Filiberto Ojeda Rios remained at large until 2005, when the FBI tracked him down. He was shot by federal agents on September 23rd in his home, where he died due to blood loss. There were 2 official investigations into the matter that came up with different conclusions, neither being very flattering to the FBI in Puerto Rico. So, where does Oscar López Rivera fit into this whole very much condensed history of Puerto Rican nationalism? Well, what we know is that he served in the U.S. Army during Vietnam and returned to his home in Chicago after his tour was over, where he became a community organizer. It was during that time that he joined the FALN to support the nationalist movement. The U.S. government convicted him of seditious conspiracy and possession of explosives. It did not convict him of conspiracy to commit murder, which is what opponents of his release basically accuse him of when they say he's a terrorist. The government never proved that he had anything to do with the Francis Tavern bombing or any other bombing, or that he even knew about it before they happened. That said, Oscar is no Nelson Mandela either. While Nelson Mandela spoke about violence being a justifiable means of resisting the apartheid government, after serving his time for seditious conspiracy, he became an advocate for strict, nonviolent resistance. It was that philosophy that brought his cause international support and ultimately defeated apartheid in South Africa, much like it did previously with Mahatma Gandhi in his stance against the British rule of India. One of the unfortunate side effects of all this is that opponents of Puerto Rico's independence have been able to label all people that propose independence as violent radicals, conveniently forgetting that conservative radicals on the island have also committed violence to support the cause of statehood. But that's yet another Boricua lesson, this one specifically about nationalism. Regardless, Oscar López Rivera was not pardoned. His sentence was commuted after already serving 35 years in prison. As far as I can tell, that was the right call to make. Truth is, he could do far more harm to the U.S. internationally as a political prisoner than a former nationalist fighter from an isolated fringe group. Throwing the word terrorist around doesn't absolve anyone from meeting the actual burden of proof. We all, myself included, tend to give more importance to victims that we see as part of our group, and less to the victims of any group that we see as other. It's too easy for us to think about people labeled other as collateral damage. Oh, it's okay to kill those people because someone else that belongs to that group killed some of our people. They're just communists. They're just capitalists. They're just Muslims. They're just Christians. They're just Puerto Ricans. They're just gringos. That kind of thinking shields us from the truth. We are all the same people. It's well past time we recognize that. And if someone like Oscar López Rivera can find redemption for whatever it is that he did do while he was in the FALN, outside of the federal prison system, which, let's be honest, could really use some redemption itself, then maybe, just maybe, there is some hope for the rest of us too. Think about it. This is White Eagle's Revenge, saying that people who lose their history lose a big part of themselves. And I hope you learned something today.